So friends, for today's video, we're going to be doing a new fantasy releases wrap up, and the 3 books we'll be discussing would be the Nightblood Prince, the Night and the Moth, as well as the Enchanted Greenhouse. A quick heads up, I, as always, will have timestamps in the description bar in case you'd like to skip ahead to any one specific book or reference back to them at a future date, and in addition, I do always include links to the books in case you do want to check them out for yourself, but I actually read the Nightblood Prince and the Enchanted Greenhouse as arcs, and they will be released very close to when this video goes up, but there's a chance that this might go up just before one of them is actually out, if not 2 of them, but just know that they will be released very, very soon in case you do go to check them out and it turns out it's just a pre-order link. All that out of the way, jumping into it, I'm going to kick it off with the Enchanted Greenhouse. So this is written by Sarah Beth Durst, whose works I have enjoyed. Every single thing by this author I've picked up, I've quite liked, and the thing that I would say consistently is true as far as my feelings toward their works is that I always think that the settings are incredibly vibrant, well thought out, and they very much tie into the actual plots and how characters navigate the world. It doesn't necessarily mean the plots and the characters are the same from one story to the next, so I actually think there's a really good chance that if one thing doesn't work for you from this author, then something else might. And up until this point, I have liked everything I've picked up, which includes the Queens of Renthia trilogy. I thought the forest setting and just how bleak the circumstances were was really well established in that. People can die at a moment's notice, and the stakes are very, very high. And then you have the Race the Sands novel that is actually a standalone, which I always thought, how am I going to end up liking this? Because it's like a racing plotline and coach athlete sort of feel to it, and that doesn't necessarily feel like a recipe for an amazing fantasy standalone novel, but it was great. I thought it was quite exceptionally done. I really enjoyed the way that you have this parental figure who cares not only for her own daughter, but also ends up caring very much for somebody else who is a child, and the relationship mentor-mentee was really well established in that. And then we had the first cozy fantasy by this author called The Spell Shop, and it was one of my favorite cozy fantasy stories that we had gotten, and this story actually, The Spell Shop, is within the same world as the Enchanted Greenhouse. You do not have to read one before reading the other, but I also would go as far as to say that if you don't like one, you might still like the other, and I'm saying that because that is what happened to me. Unfortunately, the Enchanted Greenhouse was my first, I guess you could say, strike. I didn't dislike my reading experience with this story, but I found that it was the kind of cozy fantasy that I don't usually connect with, and so I want to get into the specifics of that and also how it ties to The Spell Shop for those of you that are interested in the connections. So I really enjoyed The Spell Shop because something I think that is accurate, but sometimes can be an overgeneralization of cozy fantasy, is that sometimes it leans so much into the cozy and so much into the comfort and the cute factor that it can start to feel as though maybe there's not as much substance. I even hesitate to use that phrasing though, because I think from one person to the next, from one reader to the next, what we prescribe substance to, it's just very dependent from one reader's experience to the next, because we all come to things with different experiences of our own, so then something that might just seem a little too cotton candy cute in actuality might bring somebody so much joy, and they might really connect with the characters or the themes, and thus it doesn't really matter if it came through the lens of something cozy, and if it was really cute, because at the end of the day it really impacted them. So I don't say that sometimes cozy fantasy can lack substance as a way to dismiss people's connections with them, but rather just that some of them, I do think, try to stay in the more comforting, lovely bubble, and some of them have that as the backdrop, and certainly that's a general feeling, but then end up tackling other things within them that can hit really, really hard. Or maybe some of the themes are slightly more tragic in nature. So there's a fluctuation, of course, from one cozy fantasy to the next. And actually, one of the ones that people point to as being a favorite that I actually felt was sitting a little bit more in the cotton candy cute is The House in the Cerulean Sea. Most people love that one. For me, I just wanted a little bit more from it. So your mileage may vary with cozy fantasy. And I found that the Enchanted Greenhouse leaned a little bit more into The House in the Cerulean Sea territory as far as how I connected to it, or my lack of connection to it. So the setup is that you have this woman at the beginning of the story who ends up being severely punished by being turned into a statue. In their world, there has been somewhat of a government takeover And they have been really restrictive when it comes to who is allowed to use magic and also who even has the ability to know about magic. And our main character ends up creating something with magic that she was not meant to create. And this is a creature that ends up being a sentient spider plant. You actually see this plant in the spell shop. And this person that made the plant is referenced. So that is who your protagonist is within this story. So that's kind of like the little connection, but really you don't need to read one to read the other. It doesn't go that in depth with the connections. But regardless, because she made something and she was not supposed to, she didn't have permission to do this, they punished her very severely by turning her into a statue. And she kind of still has consciousness, so time is just going by and she's sort of frozen, obviously, because she's a statue. And then one day she finds herself unfreezing or no longer being petrified, and she is just in this forested area. She doesn't really know where she is, but she thinks, well, somebody must have freed me, and somebody got me out of the area I was in, because this is not where I was turned into a statue. This is not where I was petrified. So where am I and who helped me? So she goes exploring and discovers all of these interconnected greenhouses, and eventually she ends up finding somebody who is maintaining these greenhouses that seems very aloof and unsure, and they don't seem to know entirely what was going on with her, so she still is kind of confused about the specifics of how she came to be no longer a statue, but she is alone aside from this person who is maintaining these greenhouses. So she decides, well, I'm alive again. I've missed potentially years of my life. I don't know what's going on. I don't know the state of the world. So I'm just going to do everything I can to get that from this guy. So I guess I'll help him maintain these greenhouses, I suppose. And in doing this, she ends up having connections with the plants and the various greenhouses, of which I think this is where the book really shined. I started talking about this by talking about how well I think this author from book to book establishes settings, and this was my favorite part. The greenhouses truly are enchanting. They're whimsical, they're beautiful. The way they were described was very, very vivid, and I actually really could see this being almost a Pixar movie or something, where you could just really bring to life kind of the bizarre nature from one greenhouse to the next, and everything would be so gorgeous. It would be a feast for the eyes, I think. And it could be so cute, because the themes really do, I think, have aspects to them that feel like things that most of us in our day-to-day lives can connect with. And that sense of loneliness, and also trying to fit in when you feel like nobody really understands you, that was a big part of the story. And these two characters just kind of learning about each other and the fate of these greenhouses. And unfortunately, the stakes get raised when, with there only being the two of them, the greenhouses don't have enough people to take care of them, and there are magical aspects to it that seem to be failing. And so they're doing what they can to try to save the greenhouses and all the plants, of which some of them do have sentience as well. And they're trying to do what they can to save the plants and their homes and their brethren, but things are starting to crumble and they can't figure out why. And I did like aspects of the story. I just think that where the spell shop dug into grief, and it also had themes of loneliness as well, but I really think more connected to how those things were portrayed, and I felt more connected to the main character. I felt like some of the dialogue and the ways that characters interacted, while it maintained a whimsical nature to it, I thought it was slightly more on the realistic side, whereas in this, I felt like everybody was not quite a caricature. I wouldn't say it went into that territory, but everybody was exuding charm or quirkiness or eccentricities that made them feel a little bit less easy to connect with for me. But this is something that is true for me, I would say, across books, is when characters start to become really larger than life. I sometimes don't really end up finding myself connecting with them as strongly. And when it's your main character, I didn't dislike this character. I just thought she felt a little much, you could say. But I actually think that is another reason why I envision this as a Pixar movie, because I feel like the larger-than-life characters sometimes really shine in those sorts of environments. So in a way, I felt like it almost was a matter of expectations. If you go into this expecting it to be the setting being cozy fantasy, but it's using the lens of cozy fantasy to tell this like deep and kind of sad, melancholy story, I wouldn't exactly say that's what this one was. It was a little bit more upbeat and silly and was sweet and cute. It just ended up not entirely working for me, but I still think it's going to very much work for a lot of other people. And if it doesn't work for you, again, as I stated before, there's a very good chance that this author's other works will still hit the mark. Switching now to the Nightblood Prince, I had seen a lot of chatter about this author's other work that came out not so long ago, and I, unfortunately, because I do try to go into stuff without knowing too much about it, I thought there's no way I can go into this other work without having some bias, but when I was able to read an arc of the Nightblood Prince, I thought this is the perfect opportunity to be introduced to this author's writing. And I would definitely read something else by this author in the future because there were aspects of the story that I really thought were quite well done. It was just that the things that I didn't care for as much kind of ended up tipping the scales in the I'm not going to continue on with this story, but the things that were done well, if those end up being the highlights in something else this author writes, I could see really liking a future work of theirs quite a lot. And I do want to make clear before I jump into the synopsis that the thing that I didn't like as much within this story actually is tied to the romantic elements of what you get. I thought the character development and some of the decisions that she's trying to make for herself, the protagonist, are the things that I thought were really well done, and they were very complex, and I feel like the author didn't really pull punches when it came to actually depicting the difficult decisions that our protagonist had to make. But when it came to the romantic elements, I didn't really like the characters that were love interests in the story. I didn't really feel like the relationships were developed in a way that I personally found compelling, but I want to make really clear, just because even though probably I don't have to state this, I just feel like the state of where fantasy versus fantasy romance is right now, I would want to err on the side of caution and clarity, which is that I'm by no means trying to imply that I would prefer that romances be taken out entirely and that everything's bogged down with romance these days or anything like that. I just didn't really love how the romances were done in this story, and I would have preferred it, this particular one, if the romances were taken out, just because I thought the other things were done really well. But I am not somebody who takes issue with the existence of romances in books, and I think that they can do a really great job of being written in stories and reflecting our own worlds and complex emotions and trauma, and there's a lot that you can do with it. So anyway, that probably unnecessary clarification aside, the setup for the story is that you have a character who, if she wanted, she could marry somebody who is likely going to go on to hold a great deal of power. And this individual is going to likely also have a lot of concubines. They're going to be this emperor. And as a result, it is expected, of course, that they are going to be intimate with these other individuals and that they will have children. And whoever their empress ends up being, the opposite is true for them. While there might be a respect between the emperor and the empress, and while there might be a comfortable life, so to speak, by being in this position of power, at the end of the day, there is some choice and agency taken away. And the balance between them is certainly not equal. The emperor will have so much more power than the empress. And our main character is the individual that the emperor is likely going to marry, and he actually does really care about her quite a lot. And while she cares about him and they were childhood friends, there were circumstances outside their control that kind of forced everybody to push them toward a path where they would become the emperor and the empress. And our main character is somebody who doesn't really want to have her life decided for her, certainly when, even though there are a lot of aspects to being the empress that would provide her with comfort and safety, the very idea that it's not her choice and that it is being forced upon her, that just makes it so that it's too much for her. She wants to be able to have some say over her own life. And what I thought was done well within this story is that I feel like oftentimes with these sorts of circumstances, the kind of political pairings of characters is a lot of times they don't like each other or they don't really even know each other, and the character, it's easy to connect with them and relate to them on the level of like, yeah, I wouldn't want to be married off to some stranger. I wouldn't want to be married off to this horrible person. So to actually have that sort of subversion of expectations where, no, they were childhood friends. They genuinely care about each other. There's potentially even attraction between them, and they might grow to care about each other in a romantic way. That's present. So really now the decision is, do I want control over my own life, or do I want to pick the easy path and then not have as much agency? And I think that presented for a much more compelling decision for this character. And the decision she makes for herself is, no, I want to have agency over my own life. And you find yourself initially really, really rooting for her because you do like the idea that even though this was a tremendously difficult decision, and in some ways you kind of feel bad for the character who she's like, no, you're going to be the emperor. If this is the decision you want for yourself, that's great. I don't want to give up my freedom to be at your side. And if you want to abandon that, then maybe that's a different conversation. And he's like, well, I can't abandon that. And she's like, well, then that's it. That's the decision. And so I actually thought it brought a level of challenge to what we typically see. But also I was rooting for the idea that she is going to make a path for herself. And where I thought additionally, there was a lot of things to this that I enjoyed was that it's not just her life that's impacted by this. By making this decision, she ends up impacting her family's lives. And that is where I can't really say too much else pushed past that point, because that's where it gets into, of course, the way everything unfolds, and that would be spoilers. But how she continues to somewhat maintain a relationship with the person that was her childhood friend, and then also where another figure enters the picture who is vying for power, and the way that you're told about this character, you don't know if you can trust everything, and there's violence, and there's potential for war, and our main character wondering, because of the very reasons that pushed her toward the fate in the first place, she's wondering, am I making the most selfish decision in my actions, not just because of how it's impacting my family, but was there truth to these prophecies that pushed everybody to have me go toward the emperor? And I really thought there was a lot of layers to all of that. That was very interesting. But when it did kind of have a shift from, am I being selfish? Should I have made this choice? Should I have just accepted life as everybody wanted it for me? When it shifted from that to essentially kind of a love triangle story, it lost me a little bit. Just, I mean, enough, like I said at the beginning, to not want to really continue with the story, because I thought the dynamic between our protagonist and the character that is potentially the future emperor, I thought that was a little bit more developed. The other character, and also the kind of cool fantasy things that came into the picture because of that character, which I can't say too much because I don't want to reveal too much if you don't know. But the synopsis kind of gives some stuff away. So if you haven't heard or read the synopsis, maybe don't go look, because I thought the way that a certain fantasy thing was integrated was really quite fun. But regardless, the relationship dynamics and development between our main character and this character fell a little flat for me. The character, it's like they were too silly at times, and also they have this reputation of being formidable, and I just thought there was like a slight conflicting way that they behaved versus people's perception of them versus even how sometimes they behave. Like they kind of would go back and forth, and I think it was intentional because there is a aspect to their personality that's like they're putting on a front versus who they really are, but I still felt like at times there was a little too much conflict where they just kind of felt silly to me. And then also the development of the relationships between the three characters just didn't quite work for me. So then there was a part of me that's like, I kind of just dug when it was a character forging a path for themselves and less of this being a story about a love triangle in a sense. That's not all it is, of course, but it did lose me a little bit there. But certainly, I think a lot of people are going to enjoy the aspects that I enjoyed and are going to really enjoy the love triangle components to the story. So if it sounds intriguing to you, I think there were a lot of things about it that might end up ticking some boxes for what you're wanting to check out. And then last for today, we have The Night and the Moth. I did mention in my mid-year wrap-up, because I read this just before the end of the middle of the year, that this one ended up being something that didn't work for me. So unfortunately, this is one of the rare new fantasy releases wrap-ups where nothing really fit my taste. But hopefully there will still be plenty about these books that sounds really good to you. And I think that's certainly going to be true for The Night and the Moth. The setup for the story is you have this woman who is essentially like this priestess where people come through and they end up having these visions by drowning themselves, and then they, while they're in this state, they have these visions and they're speaking through their actual body, and then there is somebody who is recording what is being stated and then relaying it to whoever has sought them out for their visions. And our main character is one of these people. She's grown up in this area. She sees this as basically like the person who took her in, the woman that took her and many of the other girls in, as her savior, because she really wasn't living a very good life before that. And the thing is, this particular profession kind of robs you of your entire identity, to a point where she's not even known by her name. She is known as a number. And this is true for her and I'll call them her sisters, the other women who are in this area and also have this profession. So all of them kind of have this, but they have each other at the very least. And they do kind of dream about what's life going to be like once we're outside of this, because once you reach a certain age, or once you reach a certain point, you can leave. And so they're all kind of coming up on that, and they're wondering what life is going to be like. The atmosphere is something I think people have pointed to this author as really liking, because I definitely think there is this sort of gothic feeling to both this and One Dark Window. I actually DNF'd One Dark Window, not because I hated it, because it just wasn't quite clicking for me, and that's kind of true of The Night and the Moth as well. But I still really agree with people who like the way that this author establishes the atmosphere. The way that the gargoyles are shown, sometimes they're eccentric and funny, and other times they're really alarming and disturbing, and you wonder, do they have some knowledge of mysteries that we're going to be clued into, or they say things that sound very cryptic, or they behave in certain ways that's very mysterious. And so you can't really tell, are they just these beings with that they are just odd, or is there something to what they're saying that I should be paying attention to? So there's that element, and just the general creepiness, for lack of a better word, of the setting, I thought was something that I was quite enjoying, and I think a lot of other people would really enjoy. But the main character's world kind of gets flipped upside down when the new young ruler comes through and he seeks a vision, which is of course what people are there to do. And he has a very loyal group of people with him, including this particular guard who instantly perturbs our main character, and they kind of get on each other's nerves, but they push each other. And he says something that gets under her skin, which is that basically, you know nothing about the real world, so what are you going to do when you leave here? You're not even going to know, one, how to live life. You don't know how to live life currently. You don't even know yourself, and you're very clueless. And so she doesn't really like this, so she decides, well, I want to find out some things for myself. And at the beginning of the story, I really liked the atmosphere, but some of the plot progression and the ways that characters were interacting was not exactly my cup of tea. But then there was a slight shift where it became slightly more horror-oriented, where suddenly the other sisters at this place start going missing, and in ways that don't make any sense. And they also wear these things around their faces, these veils, and they don't really take them off, and there's a part where a character does, but you don't see, but she clearly saw her own reflection, and she seemed disturbed, and I was pulled in at this point, because I was like, okay, here we go. We got the ball rolling. I'm very invested in what's happening, and I want to know what's going on. So in my head, I was like, it's going to turn into like a cool fantasy, gothic, murder, mystery, horror story. Sign me up. That sounds awesome. And then it kind of didn't. I mean, it sort of did, because our main character is motivated to discover what's happened to her sisters, and she ends up joining forces with this new young ruler and his merry band of misfits, I'll say. She ends up joining them to try to determine more. And also, these women are respected, and so the young king is like, it couldn't hurt to have you along with me. It might help me in my goals. So they do join forces, and I was kind of like, oh, I now we're kind of traipsing about, and we're going up against these sort of religious figures in history, and we're deciding, like, are they actually magical? Do they have all of the things about their lore? Is it true, or is it actually a big lie? And how does the power and the magic work? And how does all that connect to the powers that our main character had when it came to having visions? And I started to check out again, and I found myself kind of being pulled back in at times, because some of the lore was really fascinating and cool, and then other times not really being as invested. And then I didn't really love the ending. So then I kind of was like, well, that didn't quite work for me. But I could see it working for a lot of people. And when I talked about this before, I was noting that I just think there's something about how this author delivers the world building to you and the plot that I have a hard time really feeling fully like my feet are firmly on the ground, which is not a problem it feels like most people have with this author's works. But as soon as I start to get invested, we start to kind of shift gears. And that's not a bad thing. For a lot of people, I think that's going to make them feel like they're always on the edge of their seat. and that they never know what's going to happen next. But for me, I start getting really interested in what feels like, oh, okay, like this is where we're going with the plot. And then we sort of start to do something else. And if I were potentially always invested in whatever the new turn of events is, then maybe I would by the end like it. But then sometimes I just feel like, oh, I liked that, and now you're taking it away. And I think another way to describe it is the plot's kind of meandering to some degree, not necessarily in opposition to that. There's plenty of stories that don't even have a clear plot, and I still really find myself liking them. But I think with this, the 2 books I've tried by this author, One Dark Window, which I DNF'd, and then this one, which I read in its entirety, both times I've felt like there's a meandering nature and there's sort of new revelations that sort of once again change. And again, as I'm saying it aloud, I'm like, that's not really a problem. I know it's not a problem, and it's not a problem for me. It's not a problem for a lot of other readers, but it's something about the meandering nature of this author's works that I just don't seem to find myself connecting to, which is not by any means an objective flaw of this author's work. It's just an unfortunate outcome for me, and hopefully not for you. That's it though for a new fantasy releases wrap up. If you are interested in any of these, I'll have them all linked in the description bar. Of course, feel free to elaborate on how you felt about these books. If you feel similar or completely different or somewhere in the middle, whatever your feelings are, feel free to leave those in the comments. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.